old farmer was going down to the river to get water, and every day he would go down and he would carry his 2 buckets with him. He would head down to the river and he would fill up the buckets and he would come back and he would water the animals and water the garden, and he'd make multiple trips every single day down to the river. Well, one day, one bucket looked at the other bucket and started noticing something. The other bucket was cracked, and thought of a few creative things, and maybe call him a cracked pot, but instead he just decided to ask the farmer, well, what in the world are you carrying this cracked bucket around? He leaks like a sieve. And by the time you get from the river back to the farm, there's no water left in the bucket. Why am I the only one working here? Well, the farmer said, just you wait and see. And every day the farmer carried the cracked bucket and the whole bucket down to the river. And every day by the time he got back to the farm, the cracked bucket was empty and the whole bucket was full. Now, which one would you want to be? You want to be the whole bucket, right? You want to be successful. You want to fulfill a purpose. You want to keep the water inside of you by the time you get back. But time went on, and one day the farmer said, now, he turned to the whole bucket, and he says, I want you to pay attention here. I want you to look, and look at the side of the path that we walk every single day. Look at your side of the path. And so the whole bucket looked over to his side of the path, and sure enough, there was dry dust and rocks along the side of the path. Then the farmer said to the whole bucket, I want you to turn and look on the other side of the path where the cracked bucket has been carried. And he looked over there, and there was beautiful, lush grass and flowers growing, and all of a sudden he became a little bit jealous. And the farmer said, that's why I carried the cracked bucket every single day, even though he leaked like a sieve. We start a series today. You've heard the term righteousness. Well, we're going to do a different series. This series is called A Righteous Mess. Which do you want to be, the righteous bucket or the righteous mess bucket, right? We're going to take a look and see how God engages with our brokenness, how God engages with us in our brokenness, and how he uses our brokenness mingled with his grace to turn the path of life into one of beauty. Come with me to the book of John. I know we just finished a series in the book of John, but we're going to go back and catch a few stories, looking at it from a different angle, a different light. John chapter 4, beginning in verse 1, tells us, now when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus didn't baptize, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. He had to pass through Samaria. So first of all, I want you to kind of see here, Jesus' ministry is a mess. Why is he leaving? Because there's conflict, right? John's disciples are baptizing, Jesus' disciples are baptizing, and the priests and rulers are pointing out, hey, you got more baptisms than he does, right? It used to be in church meetings, they'd call all the pastors together in January, and they'd bring all the pastors there, and they would post up on the screen the baptism numbers. This pastor had 52 baptisms. That pastor only had 25, and this pastor had 2. And they would publicly put that up there to inspire pastors to do better, right? Any of you ever been inspired by being shamed? By showing how much better everybody else is doing than you are? It just inspires you to want to work harder, doesn't it? No, not really. So Jesus is leaving this area. There's comparison going on, and Jesus doesn't want his disciples to get caught up in all of this back and forth of comparing who's better than the other in the conflict that's going on. And so he heads off to teach his disciples what true ministry is all about. And they leave Judea and they head down to Galilee, and it says it came to pass that they passed through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and so Jesus, wearied as he was with his journey, sat down beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. Doesn't mean a lot to us. That means it was incredibly hot. If you want to translate that, it was hot, the sun was beating down, and Jesus comes and he sits down by the well. He sends his disciples off, and they head into town to find food. And there, during the middle of the day, comes a woman along the path. Now, you may already be aware of this, but but most people don't go out in the heat of the day to do their hardest work. Any of you think, when it's 102 degrees outside, the sun is beating down, yeah, now it's time to go, let's go do some yard work. No, what do? We either go out in the morning before it gets hot, or we wait until it cools off and the evening breeze comes along and we go out in the evening, right? You don't want to work in the heat of the day. There was a reason she was headed to the well in the heat of the day. She wanted to avoid meeting up with anybody else. Have you ever felt that way? Had one of those days where you just did not want to meet anybody else? You didn't have the energy, you didn't want to meet anybody else, you didn't want to deal with anyone else. Well, apparently this woman made a habit of not wanting to deal with anybody else and came to the well in the heat of the day. You can imagine the sun beating down. She's got sweat flowing off of her, and she's carrying her bucket. She's got her head down, focused on getting there to the well, doesn't want to see anybody else working in the fields around her, doesn't want to come into contact with anybody else, and she heads over there to the well with her head down, and she begins to get ready to lower her bucket when all of a sudden a voice speaks. Now, I don't know about you, but as I picture the scene, I imagine her jumping out of her skin at that moment, right? Doesn't realize that there's someone else sitting at the well. She's out there all by herself. No one else has ever been there when she shows up, and all of a sudden, someone speaks to you in that moment. And that adrenaline rushes through her body, and she realizes that her worst fear has come to pass. She is face to face with a stranger, for one, a man, for two, and a Jew, for number three. 3 strikes right there against Jesus. Now, if you're trying to connect with someone, trying to reach someone, is this how you're going to start out? Like 3 strikes before you even start the conversation, right? No, that's not the way you want to build a connection or relationship. But this is where Jesus is at in this incredibly awkward moment, in this incredibly difficult, he's seeking a way to bridge the gap and cross over to connect with this woman. And so he asks her for a drink. Give me a drink, Jesus says. In verse 8, for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. This strife between nations and races is nothing new. It's been around since time began, basically. And she doesn't want to interact, and so she's putting up walls and putting up barriers. If you're going to break down a wall, you probably, well, at least I would not have done what Jesus did, but I'm not Jesus, right? So Jesus responds to her. He asks for a drink. That's okay. That's all right. And the woman says, hey, you've got nothing to draw with, and what's going on here? Jesus answers and says, if you knew the gift of God, right? If you knew the gift of God, he totally ignores the wall she puts up. Now, I don't recommend you do this. Guys, if a lady puts up a wall, respect her boundary, right? You're not Jesus. but she puts up a boundary, right? And she throws it up, and Jesus just totally ignores it, and he steps past it. And he says to her, if you knew the gift of God and who it was that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. He offers her something that she doesn't have. Offers her something better than what she's seeking. The woman said to him, sir, you don't have anything to draw with, and this well is deep. Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself and his sons and his cattle? Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. The water that I shall give him will become in him a spring of water welling up unto eternal life. Man, don't you want that water? Don't you want that water? A well of water that springs up and never runs dry, and you will never thirst again, and it leads ultimately to eternal life. I just imagine being there in that moment, and my response would be, hey, give me this water, right? Hey, give it to me like yesterday. Like, why haven't you come before? I want it now. And so she looks at Jesus, and she responds accordingly. She says, sir, give me this water that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. She's thinking in her mind, man, if I have water and I never thirst again, I'll never have to be in contact with anybody ever again, right? I'm trying to avoid people. Hey, if I don't get thirsty, I don't have to come to this well. I don't have to take the risk. I don't have to walk down that hot, dry, dusty path. I don't have to take that risk ever again. Give me this water so that I don't have to engage with those in my community. Give me this water so that I can isolate to myself, so that I can hole up to myself. Man, I just had a whole nother sermon thought hit me. We could preach on that for a while. When Christ gives us the living water, how many times do we as a church want to hole up and isolate to ourselves and withdraw from the world and withdraw from the connection and the conflict that comes with being connected? We'll have to have a sermon on that another time. Give me this drink so that I may not thirst nor come here to draw. Jesus said to her, go call your husband and come here. Man, he's finally made a breakthrough, right? She's now engaging and talking to him. She now wants what he has to offer, and now he goes here, right? Is that where any of us are going? Raise your hands if the first thing you're going to do once you start engaging someone is call out the embarrassing things in their life. All right, we got one. We got one honest soul here, right? One brave soul here who will follow the example of Jesus. I don't know how that will go for you, sir, but it went okay for Jesus, but he's God, we're not. Anyway, so he points out, go get your husband, and he's headed down a path here because he sees a deeper need, a deeper issue going on for her. Go call your husband and come here. The woman answers to him, I have no husband. And Jesus says to her, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the guy you're living with now isn't your husband. He's known her like 3 minutes, and now I don't advise you go there, right? There's several things you don't talk to a woman about: her age, her weight, and how many boyfriends or husbands she's had, right? Just don't go there. But Jesus goes there because he sees there is a hole in this woman's heart. He sees there is a brokenness in this woman. And when Jesus sees brokenness, he sees an opportunity to minister. See, too often when we see brokenness, when someone sees brokenness in us, it's an opportunity for criticism, right? When we see brokenness in us, what do we tend to do to ourselves? We criticize ourselves and we get down on ourselves. When Jesus sees brokenness, he sees an opportunity to grow green grass, an opportunity to grow flowers. He sees an opportunity to change things. Jesus is seeking to connect with not her wholeness, but her brokenness. Jesus is seeking to connect with her in her brokenness. At first glance, her brokenness would seem to be what? Shame, right? She wants to avoid connection with anybody. I was reading an article in Scientific American, and the author was describing the different symptoms of shame and how it interacts in our bodies and in our minds, and how it interferes with our personal relationships with one another. And the fear of shame, which, by the way, can come from all sorts of things. Shame generally comes from violating a social norm. It doesn't have to be a moral failure, right? If everybody is wearing blue in a society and I come out wearing green, there's a temptation and a fear that I will be shamed because I will be different, right? There's nothing moral or immoral about the color green or versus blue. It's just being different can bring about shame or embarrassment. But violating social norms in the moral realm can do the same thing, right? And so we see this woman isolating herself and withdrawing, which, by the way, is another symptom of ongoing shame that's not dealt with. Isolating ourselves, and over time they've discovered that we tend to break connection with people. It starts simply, like we don't make eye contact because we're fear of someone judging us. We're fear of someone rejecting us because there's this sense of insecurity because of whatever that root cause is of shame, of maybe being different or outside the norm of the group. And so we start by shifting and averting our eyes, and because we're afraid of that rejection. And then over time that shame gets stronger and stronger, and we start withdrawing ourselves, and we don't go to places where we might experience shame or rejection. And then pretty soon we hole up to ourselves, and following isolation comes depression. It becomes a vicious cycle because now not only are you afraid that others will judge you, but now you're judging yourself, and now you are in a state of depression and you don't feel good. And that's the reality that Jesus is facing when he comes and he meets with this woman. He's not calling her out based on her husband because he's concerned that she's had multiple moral failures in her life. He's connecting with her in her brokenness so that he can help draw her out of this cycle, this spiral she's in, where she has come to the place where she cannot connect with other human beings, where her whole life is one of constant avoidance because of the fear of rejection and condemnation. See, Jesus comes to us not to moralize, but to heal. Not to condemn, but to connect. And so when he approaches us in our brokenness, when he points out the areas where we have fallen short or where we repeatedly fall short, it's not to condemn us. It's not to make us feel bad about ourselves. It's actually the exact opposite. He knows that our brokenness will make us feel bad about ourselves, and he wants to restore us and take away that negative pattern of thinking from our minds. So Jesus comes to her, and he points out the source and the cause of her shame. By the way, there is a difference between guilt and shame. There's a difference, as I was continuing reading the article there in Scientific American about this. The guilt and shame are cousins, right? They're related. Oftentimes, if you feel guilty, it will lead to shame. Sometimes shame will lead you to do things that cause you guilt, right? The two are related, but they are distinctly unique, and it's important to understand the difference. Shame is unhealthy. Guilt is healthy. You may be saying, hold on a second, we don't like guilt, we don't want guilt in our lives. But think about it this way, okay? So shame is a fear of outward rejection or being cut off, which then leads us to isolate and cut ourselves off so we don't get cut off by others. So we end up in the spot we fear by placing ourselves in that exact spot, trying to avoid that spot, if it makes sense, right? It makes no sense at all, right? But that's what shame and fear does. Fear is a liar that leads us to do things that don't make sense. So shame is concerned with outward rejection coming towards us. Guilt, on the other hand, is an inward concern for how my actions have impacted someone else. Let me tell you a story to illustrate it. Stories are always best. So when I was a kid, we had these huge walnut trees in our yard. We had these huge black walnut trees, and we had all sorts of fun with them. We'd go out there with a baseball bat and see how far we could hit them. We had a horse pasture down there. We'd see if we can hit them over the horse pasture, over the road on the other side of the horse pasture, and out into the neighbor's field. I'm sure he loved his alfalfa field being filled with walnuts, but anyway, that's beside the point. So then I discovered that I could hit it a certain distance with a baseball bat, but if I got out a tennis racket, you could really launch those things. And they would fly way, way, way out in that field. So then it became not getting it over the road. It became a competition to see who could hit it the farthest, right? And get it farthest down in the field. And so one day, some of our friends were over. We'd get together with them a lot. They'd come over after church, and we were there. And so my buddy and I, we were out there, and we were hitting walnuts, and we decided to start throwing walnuts, right? So we had this huge tree down at the other end of the house, and so we were seeing who could hit the tree the most. And his sister was over there playing, and we had been told, don't throw anything towards people at all, right? Your aim's not that good that you'll avoid them. But we were, seeing who could hit the tree the most. And so I remember I reared back and I threw a walnut as hard as I could at that tree, and it missed the tree, and it hit his sister. And immediately the tears just started coming down her face, and I felt awful. And I went racing over there feeling so bad, wanted to make sure she was okay, that I hadn't hurt her and things. And then she heads in the house. And now I'm thinking her parents are in there. She's going to go tell her parents that I just whacked her with a walnut. Guilt was my first reaction. Now I'm in the realm of shame. What are her parents going to think about me? What are they going to say about me? What are they going to talk to my parents about? Right? You see the difference between guilt? Guilt, my immediate feeling of guilt was that I had hurt someone, and I wanted to go care for them and see what I had done. Shame is the fear of what her parents were going to think or do to me, right? That's the difference. Guilt is actually a healthy thing that helps us to address our wrongs. Shame is an unhealthy thing that locks us in a spiral of hiding them. By the way, do you know what the genesis of shame is? The genesis of shame is actually found right there in the book of Genesis. And it shows us right there that shame is a liar. Shame deceives us, right? So the Bible tells us there God creates everything, and it's perfect, and it's amazing, and it's beautiful. And then, kids, plug your ears, tells us Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed, right? Adam and Eve, there in the Garden of Eden, were naked, and specifically, it concludes by saying, and unashamed. And then Eve comes along and the serpent deceives her to doubt God, and she eats the fruit, right? And what's the next thing that happens? She goes to Adam and gives him the fruit, and now he eats the fruit, and they both realize something. They realized that they're naked. Now, is their state of dress or undress the issue in the story? It is not the issue, right? The issue has nothing to do with whether they have clothes on or not. God created them without clothes. That was perfectly fine back then for them to go around without clothes. God had set things up that way, and they weren't even aware of it. But the first thing they do when they break with God is all of a sudden they become ashamed of their appearance. They're not addressing the issue in their lives. They're not addressing their doubt of God, their mistrust of God, their broken relationship with God. They're immediately focused on their lack of dress, how others might see them, how others might perceive them. And God comes walking in the garden, and they try to make leaves to cover themselves. Then they hide from God in the garden, right? Shame leads them to run from the very one who can heal the original cause of their issue. Had nothing to do with their state of dress and everything to do with their broken relationship with God. So now Jesus is sitting here at the well, and this woman comes walking up in a state of complete shame, and Jesus connects with her by addressing the cause of her shame without condemnation. By addressing the cause of her shame with no condemnation. He just simply relates the facts of her life while offering her living water. No rejection, no isolation, no condemnation. Only connection with the God of the universe when dealing with the most broken part of her broken soul. And now something interesting happens. The Bible tells us the disciples come back. The disciples come back. And they stand a ways off because they are ashamed to go over and talk with the woman at the well. After all, she was a woman, and she was a Samaritan, and Jesus had no business sitting there talking with her. So now they are isolating themselves from Jesus in order to stay away from the woman who might cause them spiritual embarrassment as righteous, upstanding Jews. See, I would propose to you today that Jesus could care less about our righteousness, but he loves our righteous mess. He engages us in the middle of our righteous mess in order to bring about healing and wholeness and actually give us, by his grace, his righteousness. Too often we get caught up in the constant need to appear good. We put on our masks and we come to church trying to look good. When Jesus meets us in the middle of our mess and says, that's where our relationship really gets real. That's where you actually experience my love for you. That's where you will know that in spite of your brokenness, in spite of the fact that you're leaking like a sieve, I'm going to carry you around and I'm never going to let you go. In spite of the fact that you never get back to the farm with a bucket of water, I'm going to never let you go, and I'm going to keep carrying you around, and I'm going to use your brokenness, and I'm going to use that pain and that suffering that you have in your life, that hole in your heart, and I'm going to fill it so full with my love and my grace that it will just flow right out of those cracks in you, and it will minister to those around you. The disciples stand off. The woman finally leaves, and then they come and re-engage with Jesus. Isn't it kind of interesting that we, in our desire to maintain our religiosity, withhold ourselves from Jesus because he is connecting with those, that might embarrass us to hang out with. And we do it in many ways, right? We may isolate ourselves physically from them, but it isn't always physical. Sometimes it's just making sure that we're engaged in a different conversation, right? So that when that person comes through, we're not having to engage them. There's all sorts of ways that we find to avoid connecting with people's righteous mess of a life. And the disciples finally come and they ask Jesus, okay, we got some food. You want to eat? And Jesus says, no. I have already been filled to the full. Because he knows what's going on in this woman's life. He knows that there has been a radical transformation in her life. Instead of being ashamed and trying to isolate herself, what's the first thing she does? She races back to her town and finds the biggest group of people she can. The exact opposite of what she did before, now she's doing. And the first thing she tells them is, hey, you got to come see a man who told me every single last thing that I've ever done. Well, he didn't really tell her every single last thing. He just told her the big things that she was ashamed of, that she feared others would judge her for and condemn her for. And in that moment, they hear that 8-word sermon. Come see a man. Come see a man who told me what I did and loved me anyway. Come see a man who sees my brokenness and my faults and my failures, who sees me at my worst and embraces me anyway. Come see a man who can tell me what I did wrong without making me feel ashamed, who can actually, by telling me what I did wrong and that he knows, take away my shame and set me free to live a life free from shame and the fear of what others think about me, because he is the Messiah. And if the Messiah loves me and accepts me, well, let's face it, it really doesn't matter what you think about me. Right? Come see a man. A simple invitation. A simple invitation, and it was effective because of one reason. It was effective because it sprung out of her brokenness and the fact that Jesus loved her anyway. It was effective because she, who had been ashamed and fearful, was now confident and unashamed. And they were all like, man, we got to figure out what happened here. We got to figure out what happened in this woman's life, because we have lived, we know this woman, and we have seen her from the time she was a kid, and we have seen her step by step withdraw and isolate herself, and now she's here preaching a whole sermon to the whole community about what her life has been. And she says, come see this man. Let's go see him. Let's go see this man. Jesus is sitting out there with the disciples, and they're there at the well, and the disciples are saying, man, let's get out of here. Let's go before there's any other awkward, uncomfortable situations that we have to deal with. Let's leave this place before there's anything else that we will have to confront, before Jesus gets himself in any more trouble than he's already in with the priests and rulers back home. And Jesus looks out and he says, I tell you, the fields are ripe for harvest. The fields are ripe for harvest. And the disciples say, no, they're not. Not wheat harvest yet. I grew up in Walla Walla. And all around, you drive from Walla Walla to Pendleton, and it's wheat field after wheat field after wheat field as you're driving from Walla Walla to Pendleton and all out in the area. You come up towards Moscow, and it's one wheat field after the other. And when it's time for the grain to be harvested, when it's time for the wheat to be harvested, you know it, right? It's that beautiful golden color, and if you roll down your windows, you can smell the scent of sun-baked wheat out there in the field, and it's just amazing. And the disciples are looking around, and they say, it's not that time yet. And Jesus looks, and he sees these people coming across the fields, and he says, oh, yes, it is. Oh, yes, it is. Because when Jesus looked there into the town of Samaria, he saw a town that was bound and trapped in shame. A town of individuals on varying levels of dealing with the shame that they found themselves trapped in. And when they found someone who could take that away, they were coming to meet him. I believe our world is ripe for the harvest today. They don't need us to tell them what they're doing wrong, because they already feel it deep within their souls. What they need is someone to tell them, come and see a man. Come and see a man who can take away your shame. That when he finds out what you've done wrong, he doesn't go and post on social media and shame you before the entire community. That when you mess up, doesn't try and go to cancel you in front of the entire nation, right? Come see a man who will love you and accept you right where you are. Come see a man who will heal your shame and your brokenness, who will deal with your guilt and take it away so you don't have to carry it around any longer with you. Come see a man. Come see a man with power unlike any other. A man who has the power of the love of God to pour out in your heart and in your life. A man who has the grace of God to pour into your brokenness. A man who has the power to touch your heart and touch your life. And friends, if we will allow God to pour out his power into our brokenness, the world around us will come flocking to see this man. As we journey through this series, I hope you will journey with me to come and see this man.